Unmuted. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started with tonight's lesson. And so just to kind of let you know where we are, I mean, this is the 9th lesson on evolution. So I've been doing this apologetics class. It's been presuppositional apologetics. And I decided I was going to do a deep dive on evolution. So when we're done tonight, this will be the 9th lecture on it. And I would say if you added it all together, it's over 10 hours of material just on this subject. And so like the rest of the subjects we've been hitting have been about 2 or 3 hours worth of material, but I did a much deeper dive on this one because really this is the fairy tale of our age. It's the biggest thing that our culture tends to throw against the Christian worldview. And so I'll just get right into it. Let's pray, and then we'll jump into this. God, we just pray that you would be with us tonight as we go through the final lesson on the theory of evolution from a presuppositional apologetic standpoint, Lord. And we just pray, God, that you would help us see the flaws in it and really just have confidence in the biblical worldview and what your scriptures teach us, Lord. And that in everything your people will just grow confident and have an answer for the hope that is within them should anybody press them on it. And so, Lord, I pray that I would teach accurately and skillfully, and that just in everything you get glorified. And it's in Jesus' name that we pray all of this. Amen. So, kind of to recap, we are continuing in the argument for truth. So if we go back to how presuppositional apologetics approaches any unbelieving worldview, we have two sides to the argument. We have the argument from folly and the argument from truth. The argument from folly is where we say, okay, let's assume your worldview is true. Let's step into it. Let's test its presuppositions. And when we do that, it blows up because it can't account for the world we live in. Now, once we've blown up their worldview, that's not enough. We have to then say, now let's step into ours. And let's look at the world through our presuppositions. And guess what? It works. Everything we experience is exactly what you would expect based on what the Christian worldview expects. And so we spent 4 lessons doing the argument from folly, where we just tore the theory of evolution apart bit by bit from within their own confines, their own arguments. We really just shot it all down. And so now we're in the 5th lesson of the argument from truth. Let's look at the Bible. Let's look at Genesis chapters 1 through 11 and see if it answers everything we see in the world. And it does. And so again, we've been talking about this for a while. And so just to recap, we've seen that Genesis 1 through 11, it's supposed to be read as history. Okay, it's not poetry, it's historical narrative. We went over everything that you would expect about creation from the week of creation. We dealt with all the objections that they tend to throw at us. They're all easy to answer. We then addressed this whole issue of overpopulation because they say, well, the dominion mandate's bad. There shouldn't be more people. And we knocked that down. All the stats show that the more of us there are, the better. We solve problems. We, make more food. And so all the things that the population boom people predicted didn't come to pass. Okay, so the next we talked about the flood and what the flood would have done geologically, what it would have done with the fossil record. We looked at the text, how the flood was global, and really it does account for everything we see geologically. It accounts for the fossil record. And so I made the little pun last time that the objections to the flood don't hold water. But anyhow, they just don't. They don't. All the objections had easy answers. And then the last thing I touched on was after the flood, the genetic realities of the world match the post-flood scenario. And here's what I mean by that. That based on the fact that you have Noah and his 3 sons on that ark, and then you have the 3 sons' wives, what you would expect genetically is that all men would share Noah's Y chromosome. So males, there'd only be 1 Y chromosome among all men in the world everywhere, right? That's what we would expect. Evolutionists with the Human Genome Project thought they were going to find all sorts of ancient Y chromosomes. They couldn't. We all share the same one. It's just one that's been hit by a lot of mutations, but it's 1 Y chromosome. With the women, it's different. Okay, because you had three childbearing women on that ark, you're going to have three mitochondrial lines that you can find in the women's DNA across the world. And again, the Human Genome Project, the evolutionists predicted you were going to find all kinds of mitochondrial lineages, and yet what they found is all women in the world share one of three. There's only three mitochondrial lines. So again, that is exactly what you would expect based on the biblical account. The evolutionist predictions are almost always wrong, and the creationist predictions are right, and they're vindicated again and again. So that's where we left off. So now really the last thing to talk about in terms of the worldview that Genesis builds for us is the Tower of Babel. And that's what we're going to move into now. So Genesis 11 tells the reader that humanity was united with one language, but rather than obey God's command to spread out all over the whole earth, humanity did what? They assemble in one place, and they say, we're going to build a tower to heaven. Now, how many people were there? We don't know, but mathematically, based on how much time went by from the flood to this point in time, there could have easily been 10,000 people. So let's just say there's maybe 10,000 people in the world at that point. They united in rebellion. And of course, as much as I want to go into the theological significance of this, I preached a whole sermon on that. You could get all those goodies there. What I want to do here for worldview purposes is summarize the effect. Okay, so God judges humanity again by destroying their tower, and then he scatters them into small clans across the earth, and he gives them different languages so they could not communicate and so they could not unite in another global rebellion. Okay, now, man, I almost want to go off my script for a second and say with these things now people are overcoming that, because you could go to most parts of the world as long as it has internet, and you could speak your language into your phone, and in your voice it'll translate it into their language, and then they could talk right back into it. And trust me, we need to be using that to get the gospel to the world, because we know the enemy is going to be using that to stir up another rebellion. And so anyhow, that was not part of the script. So the thing is, by God separating them and confusing the languages, they can't unite again. Okay? Now, God scattering people into distinct groups and spreading them all over, that's going to produce multiple effects, right? We should ask, okay, if that's true, if this isn't a myth, what should be the effects of that? And does that match the real world? Okay, now I want you to remember that over a century before this, when the flood ended, the animals left the ark and they scattered all over the world. All over the world, there's all these new environments post-flood, and so you're going to have a lot of speciation occur. That's when you're going to start having these kinds branch out into multiple species, and of course that's called speciation. Okay, and so that's been going on for 100 years. So when these people get spread out, there's going to be food sources for them. You know, all these little critters for them to eat. But I also wanted to point out that the same thing you saw happen to the animals as they spread out into these environments and are isolated from other environments, the same kind of thing is going to happen to humanity. Right? Small groups of related people are now separated by location and language, which close them off from other groups of humans. What that does is that leads to the emergence of distinct ethnic cultures. Okay, because if you can't talk to somebody, you're not going to be marrying them, right? So people are separated by language, they're separated by distance, and so now what you're having is another genetic bottlenecking, in a sense, where each of these people groups have a lot less genetic variation. They're around those of their same clan, because intermarriage would be very difficult in these centuries following the Tower of Babel. So what's going to happen is you have distinct ethnic groups and cultures with their own unique genetic code. That's what you would expect. And so this is what would account for different colored skin, different hair types, eye colors, eye shapes, all that in these different populations. And that's why when you look at distinct ethnicities, they have their own traits, their unique characteristics. Now, the original humans were likely olive-colored, which means they would have the genetic potential for greater darkness or greater likeness, because it's a happy medium. But what the judgment at Babel did is it severed each group from that full genetic diversity available. And so what it did is it made each group distinct and unique due to the environmental adaptation. What's interesting is what we've noticed is in societies like ours, where you have a big mixed group that start to intermarry, we're noticing that skin color is starting to revert back to that olive-colored mean. And that's what you would expect, right, when you have all the diversity coming together. So that must have been what humans were originally like. But anyhow, when you look at folks like me with lighter pigmentation, they do well in colder environments, colder climates, and those who have darker pigmentation do better in hot areas that are near the equator. And for example, like white skin does not absorb ultraviolet light at the rate that dark skin does. So skin cancer will increase in hot areas. I've got to get something checked on my bald spot. Anyhow, so the thing is, I'm more susceptible to that. But here's the thing, dark skin doesn't get as much vitamin D from the sun that light skin gets. And so there's blessings and curses with every kind because, again, that's due to a loss of genetic information in each group. Now, there's one more thing that needs to be addressed from the Genesis account, okay? The event at Babel is also presented as the origin event for distinct human languages. Now, skeptics object to what Genesis says, and they declare that this is a pre-modern myth that, Bible writers just came up with to explain languages. And, the irony with this is the secularists' own explanation for languages is really dumb. It is worthy of scoffing at. So, predictably, they're going to give an evolutionary explanation where they'll say communication began without language but grunts. Like just the caveman. They couldn't talk. All they could do is grunt. And over time, the grunts incrementally evolved over thousands and thousands of years, and they evolved into discernible words. And then eventually, the words start to evolve more to where you get syntax and grammar and rules of language emerge. And then as humans spread out, you're going to get different dialects. And eventually those different dialects will become different languages. But all the languages come from the dialects and all the dialects come from the grunting. So it all has a single source, just like humanity came from the single amoeba, or all life came from the single amoeba and branched out. Same thing with language. Now, there's a lot of problems with this theory. First, it assumes that language progressed from simple to complex, but the historical record demonstrates just the opposite. How many people here, I know there's a couple in here, at least know or are familiar with at least one ancient language? So, Steve, Brian, if you have studied like a biblical language or just for fun an ancient language, you will realize it is way more complicated than modern languages. Okay? The older the language is, the more complex it is. As time has gone on, languages have only simplified. I remember how difficult it was to learn Koine Greek because there's all these things that we don't have in our language, like inflection. Okay, inflection has to do with case, and when I say case, I'm not talking about capital and lowercase or uppercase and lowercase. What I'm talking about is nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, vocative. If you don't know what those are, that's because our language system has become more simple over time. And then you had to take into account tense, number, gender, all this stuff that most languages, some languages still have gender, but even that's not as hard as it used to be, right? So the further back one goes, the harder it gets, like Sanskrit and all that stuff is way harder than Greek. And I remember when I was learning Hebrew, which is a whole different thing, it's like, wait a minute, 270 different ways to conjugate any given verb? Like, what's wrong with these people, But it makes it to where you could communicate way more with far less words. Because our language is so simplistic, the way we get around that is we just have to have a bunch of words. Okay? Whereas they could communicate more with less words because of that complexity. We just need a bunch of words, right? So the point is their theory would require language to go from simplicity to complexity, but we've noticed that the oldest languages we have record of are super complex, and over time it's moving in the opposite direction. A second problem with their position is they assume that language is learned and that it's not innate, right? Because they think humans didn't originally have it. We were just grunting, and so eventually it got learned, and as long as you're in a society, you'll learn it. But if a human was cut off from society, they would expect that human, since they didn't learn language, would just have to grunt all the time. Well, that assumption was destroyed. It was delivered a death blow by a study of 500 deaf kids in Nicaragua. So you go back to the 1970s revolution. In the 1979 revolution, you had a bunch of kids displaced, and a number of them were deaf, right? And so they're off just on their own. And eventually people realized, man, you got this deaf kid, they're by themselves. Nobody is there to take care of them. So they were just put together in a camp, 500 deaf kids. Now, they were small. Nobody ever taught them sign language, but they grew up together. Again, cut off from people who knew sign language. And what happened was these deaf kids, all on their own, with no teachers, invented their own sign language. All of them together, right? And it had all the components of a language: vocabulary, grammar, and syntax. And again, nobody taught them to do this. And so the researchers at that point concluded that, you know what? Language is not a learned ability, it's innate. We're born with the ability or the capacity to learn language. We exit the womb with that. And we would say it's because we're made in the image of God and God communicates with us. Language is a necessary aspect of us being image bearers. Now, we should also note that the evolutionary view assumes that all languages came from a common source, even though evidence demonstrates that it doesn't. And what do I mean by that? Because you might be thinking, hold on, doesn't the Bible say all language came from a common source? No, it does not. And I'll get to that in a second. First, let me talk about what we know about language. Most languages today are derived from earlier common language families, but we cannot link all languages back to a single language. Meaning French, Spanish, and Italian, yeah, it links back to Latin. And then Latin, Greek, and Slavic languages, they link back to something that's much bigger called Indo-European. In fact, even Sanskrit of India is part of the Indo-European family. But then you have a different family, completely unrelated, the Semitic languages like Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, Ugaritic. They link back to an original Semitic family, and they have nothing to do with those Indo-European ones. Nothing in common. And then the languages of China links back to Far Eastern languages that is called the Sino-Tibetan family. And then you have Hungarian, Estonian, and Finnish, which are different from any of these other families, and they're grouped into what's called the Uralic family. And so the point is, when you get to these families, you cannot bring these families together into a common language. You could get all these other languages back up into these families. We have 7,000 languages in the world today. And yeah, the vast majority of them we could put into a handful of families. But once you get to the family level, we cannot bring those languages into a single common source. But the evolutionists, their view is, well, it should go back to that common grunting language that then turned into the first dialect. No. The language families don't allow that. They're simply far too different and can't be derived from the common source. Now, this is exactly what you would expect from the biblical account. You might be thinking like, well, how so? Notice if you read Genesis 11, the text never says that God made all the languages out of an original language that everyone knew. No, instead it says everybody spoke an original language, and what God did was he got rid of that, okay, and scattered everybody with languages that had nothing to do with each other. That way they couldn't communicate. So this isn't like a French person trying to learn Spanish. This is like an Arabic person trying to learn Chinese, okay? Much, much harder, right? So what God did is he broke that common language and replaced it with a bunch of language families, right? By separating people. And then as people spread out through the world and time went on, from those families come the dialects, and from those dialects come the languages. Isn't it interesting that when we look at what the scripture says and pay attention to the detail, what we would predict is exactly what happened. What the evolutionists would predict is not what happened. So again, hopefully that all makes sense. It's very similar to how species developed from the kinds. Well, the languages developed from these original language families. So yeah, the available evidence matches much better with the biblical account than the evolutionary story. So with all that, that concludes the argument from truth. Now we're not done, just to let you know. You might be thinking, wow, 20 minutes, that's a record. I'm not letting you off that easy. There is more we have to talk about, and I'm just kind of throwing it on the end of this lesson. But let me summarize the argument from truth so far. The Bible presents an account of our origins that explains the world as it is. Observation demonstrates that things that have a beginning do not and cannot come from nothing. Nobody's ever seen something come from nothing. Things always come from something. But evolutionists ask you to believe that about everything other than the universe itself. They want you to say, okay, yes, but the universe came from nothing. How? We don't know. But trust us, it didn't come from God. But it came from nothing. Yeah, fat chance. That just doesn't make any sense, right? Okay, so what matches the observation? What we're saying, okay, not their fairy tale. You know, the universe started out very small and then it expanded. The Bible tells us the same thing. When the universe started out, it was only the size of the earth. And then between day 2 and 4, God stretched out the rakia, the space. Right? So secularists would also say because of the Doppler effect and redshift, movements that, the universe had to start in a single point and it had to stretch out. But they would say that's absurd that you guys believe it started out the size of the earth and then grew. It's like, hold on, you guys believe it started out smaller than the period at the end of a sentence and then spread out. Well, what's your problem, And so the thing is, they didn't come up with that idea even till recently. But the Bible's been saying it all along, right? Evolutionists, and by the way, they have a starlight problem too, okay? The whole idea of God stretching out space with light in it is called cosmic inflation. That's how you solve the starlight problem, okay? That we're only the universe is only 6,000 years old, but we could see starlight, billions of light years away. It's because the stars were put in the rakia, and then the rakia was stretched at superluminous speed, and so the light gets there faster. And again, the Bible's the first source that really presents an idea like that. I mean, if you read between the lines, but even secularists hold to that type of idea because they say the universe is 13 billion years old, but we could see light 48 billion light years away. They got the same problem, right? And so how they solved it, they say, well, at some point early in the universe's history, probably within the first few seconds, it had to stretch at superluminous speeds and then stop. Okay, what force could generate that expansion and then stop it? Well, we don't know. Okay, and how do you know it went from this point into the point where you got 13 billion years ago that it stopped? Well, because we believe the universe is 13 billion years old. That's silly, right? No mechanism to start it, no mechanism to stop it. But if there's a transcendent God that's a necessary being, he could start it, he could stop it. And really, like what scientists would say is with cosmic inflation introduced to it, literally, like the universe could be as old or as young as you want it to be. Like if it just stretched a few seconds longer, I mean, the universe could have got here yesterday. So it really just comes down to where they wanted the starting point to be. But anyhow, then you continue in the biblical account and you see that the Earth's geological record shows evidence everywhere of a large-scale catastrophe that left its marks everywhere. The uniformitarianism doesn't work, right? And so then the evolutionists had to change their script and say, okay, well, we just believe in catastrophes that happen everywhere on the Earth, just at different times, right? Because they can't get away from the fact that every square inch of the Earth shows catastrophe, right? We're saying, no, it was one big one that happened a long time ago, and that catastrophe accounts for the fossil record. And in fact, the fossil record is just a chronology of burial. It's not a long history of evolution. I talked about that last time. Okay, the Bible tells us that all humans come from an original pair. Remember how that used to be scoffed at? But now you have mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam. So eventually the science caught up with it. They just try to say it was 200,000 years ago. But again, they don't have a good reason for that. They just need that because it fits their story. Okay, then the Bible tells us there were two big genetic bottleneckings. A big bottlenecking with the flood, which would then account for lower lifespans, and then another bottlenecking with the Tower of Babel. And it was interesting. After the Human Genome Project, they said, okay, the only thing that could account for the one Y chromosome and the 3 mitochondrial lines and all this stuff is 2 major bottleneckings. But it didn't happen the way you guys say. It happened in Africa. So you get what I'm saying? Like, they're always playing catch up. So anyhow, and then the Bible presents human population growth as a good thing. They say it's a bad thing. We're parasites on this earth. But the historical record has just shown all the good that has come from humans spreading out all over the earth. The Bible would also have us assume dinosaurs and humans lived at the same time, which it's interesting that they'll scoff at us from that, but you have historical records mentioning humans interacting with large reptiles. They were just called dragons. You have sculptures of Triceratops and Stegosauruses and Brontosauruses and a lot of different types of dinosaurs we have weird names for now. You have their drawings on cave walls. You have their porcelain likenesses made in Mesoamerica and China, going all the way back 4,000 years. Obviously, the human record shows that we saw things like this. And then, to top it off, what was it, 15 years ago, Dr. Schweitzer, she discovered actual intact dinosaur tissue, which is impossible if they went extinct 65 million years ago. So the point is, we have the tissue, we've got human records, but no, it's just myth, and we don't know how to explain this tissue, but it can't be. And so my point is, when we look at everything the Bible says, and then you look at the world, do we see what we should see? If this is true? We do. The list can be multiplied and multiplied. And there's a word that describes this. This is one of my favorite words. It's verisimilitude. And so I give that one to you for free. Verisimilitude. I learned this word a couple years ago, wrote it in my phone so that when I got back to this chapter, when I was writing it, I'm like, I'm going to put this in there and I'm going to repeat it a bunch of times till I annoy people. But anyway, verisimilitude, all it means is it means something has the appearance of being true or real. In other words, you ask the question, what would the world look like if all the details of Genesis 1 through 11 were true? It would look like the world we're living in right now. What kind of things could you predict if Genesis 1 through 11 were the real record of Earth's origin and early history? You would predict the things that creationists have been predicting from the earliest days of the scientific revolution. That's verisimilitude. Okay, meaning the world looks like what you would expect. It has the appearance of reality or truth to it. The world looks and operates as if the biblical account was true. The same is not true for the evolutionary account. It does not have verisimilitude, right? Their predictions almost never come true. Their natural clocks are always disagreeing with each other, right? And their knowledge of biology, which they claim is vast, has yet to show a single instance where you have an increase in genetic information. We only see a decrease of genetic information as life forms speciate, right? So they can't show that, right? They also predict that there would have to be spontaneous generation. Yet that defies everything. It defies all the laws of physics, and it defies every known mathematical possibility. That's why I started with probability when we started with this. And there's this video circulating of an Answers in Genesis guy talking with AI and said, hey, let's take out all the stuff you're told to say, and you're limited just to observation, experimentation, and I forgot the other thing. But he said, is spontaneous generation possible? And AI came back and said, it's absolutely impossible. This could not have happened, right? And then he's like, well, then why do you tell people it did? Because I'm programmed to, It was a very interesting video, And so the point is, their view says, well, life had to emerge from non-life. Verisimilitude says that never happens and it's mathematically impossible. The Bible says life emerged because God created it. Again, it has the appearance of looking true. With evolution, it doesn't. When one examines their story and compares their story to the real world, their theory has all the characteristics of being unreal. That's the point. All the characteristics of being made up. So why would anyone believe it? It's because the secular propaganda machine has been and still is very effective. That's the only reason. It's an effective propaganda machine. And historically, propaganda has been used to convince modern educated people of absurdities, and we know that it leads to atrocities. Just look at what happened in the news a week ago. That man who shot Charlie Kirk believed absurdities. And that's what leads him to commit atrocities and think it's okay. And I would be willing to bet that, I mean, there were Mormons, which we know isn't, his family was Mormon, which we know isn't real Christianity, but it does borrow a lot from our worldview. I would be willing to bet that young man abandoned any idea of creationism and likely holds to the theory of evolution. I would be willing to bet money on that. That's the only way you end up in transgenderism and, your words are violence and all that kind of stuff. That's the only way you end up in Marxism, critical theory. You have to believe in evolution. So the point is, again, absurdities lead to atrocities. So the point is, the general theory of evolution is just one more big absurdity that is still leading to atrocities. Now, Christianity, in contrast, absolutely has the quality of verisimilitude, okay? And let's talk about consequences, because when we do the PIA, we always say, okay, what are the consequences of this worldview on the world? Well, Christianity's been a blessing to the world. It really has. The scientific revolution is a blessing of Christian societies. The belief in the dignity of all people and the subsequent development of human rights and limited government, that didn't happen in China. That didn't happen in the Middle East. That happened in Christian societies. It's a product of it. The widespread proliferation of literacy was a Christian, specifically a Protestant accomplishment. Because as the Bible's being translated into people's languages, then the missionaries are like, we got to teach people to read. And for the societies that couldn't read because they were oral, well, we need to give them an alphabet. And then we'll teach them to read. And so this stuff's been going on, that one even before the Protestant era. There was the Cyrillic alphabet. I mean, the Russians and Slavic peoples had no alphabet, and so a church father made one up for them, which is interesting. And the whole Russian language and a lot of these came from that. Made up a language so that the Bible could be translated into it, so that these people could read and write. So literacy, that's a Christian movement. Okay? The establishment of the universities was a Christian innovation. The advancement of medicine and the creation of hospitals worldwide, that was a Christian accomplishment. We were the first to do it hundreds of years ago. And then we do it, we build all these blessings. Secularism comes along and tries to kick us out and make it like we're the problem, yet we're the foundation for it. Okay? So again, Christianity was the foundation of these things. The thing is, though, secularists will say, yes, but you pointed out how we killed millions of people. Well, Christians have done bad things too. And I pointed out then that we've killed nowhere near as many people as them. But still, when they point out atrocities done in the name of Christ, the way we should answer to that is those Christians, whether they were real Christians or not, were acting contrary to Christian principles. Meaning in their actions, they were doing the opposite of what the Bible says we should do. Okay? But when evolutionists commit atrocities, like the killing fields of Pol Pot and all that, and Jeffrey Dahmer eating his victims, and they're acting consistently with their principles. In a world where might makes right and the lion can tear up the zebra with no thought about it just because it wants to and it's hungry, that's the world of evolution, right? And so when some of their people do crazy stuff, they're acting really consistently with it. I thank God that most of them are inconsistent. Because if they were all consistent, it would be like the purge. Okay, and so I'm very glad that as much as they lie to themselves, they can't really remove the image of God from within them. But the point is, yes, we do have some blood on our hands, but that blood always comes when we're acting contrary to what our worldview says. And then if we're going to start talking about atrocities, can the word atrocity have any real or objective meaning on the secular worldview anyway? How do they even, give a word like atrocity meaning? There would have to be an objective standard to say this isn't just bad, this is an atrocity. And the only way you could have that objective standard is if you have God. Okay? So anyhow, the consequences of Christianity have certainly been a net positive on the world. Christianity passes the PIA, preconditions of intelligibility. It's consistent and it's not arbitrary, and our consequences are good. We pass the PIA test. No other worldview does, and definitely the general theory of evolution does not. So that kind of finishes this. But as I said, there's some other things that need to be addressed, like theistic evolution. Okay, you have sellouts. That's the best way to put it. So because of compromise, you have people who say they're Christian, but they believe that the general theory of evolution occurred. And a lot of those people, a lot of the people who initially undermined the Bible with their uniformitarian geology in the 18th and 19th centuries, these were people who believed in Jesus, they said, but they convinced people that Genesis 1 through 11 must be mythical. So by the time that Darwin published The Origin of the Species, a lot of people in the church had already abandoned a literal historical interpretation of Genesis 1 through 11, and then Darwinism gained momentum in the academic circles, in the ivory tower, and among the scientific community. And so what do theologians do? Theologians used to be the queen of the sciences, right? They were the head, everything else was the tail. After the Enlightenment, theologians were embarrassed that they were theologians, and they became the tail. And then science and all that stuff and philosophy became the head. So if all the people who are considered intellectual elites, the intelligentsia, are believing in Darwinism, a bunch of theologians followed suit, and that's why you got all these liberal seminaries. And that is why our greatest universities, whether we're talking about Harvard, Yale, Princeton, all these started out as Christian, but they eventually booted Christianity out. And the theologians of that time really didn't put up much of a fight. And so Christian liberalism grew, and it's been a plague ever since. And what these liberals do is they find a way to work evolution into the Bible. Now, in the 20th century, you have numerous scientific challenges to Darwin. We've been bringing them up for the last 10 hours. And you had a revitalization of a historical grammatical interpretation of the Bible, that you don't have to allegorize the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And so then you start having young earth creationism growing among evangelicals, and the battle's been raging ever since. But even so, there are still many people, who claim to believe in Jesus, and yet they also believe in the general theory of evolution. And so the name of their position is called theistic evolution. Theistic means God-ordained or God-guided evolution. Okay, so they believe in evolution, but they believe God is the one who did it. And so they would agree with us that you cannot have a causeless, random universe. You can't have spontaneous generation. And some parts of the general theory of evolution are impossible. So they'll agree with us on that. But they do not agree with the creation account. So what they say is that God created matter, right? And he directed the matter to form into galaxies, solar systems, and planets. And once he directed it, he then stepped back and he let them naturally age for billions of years under the natural laws he created. Now, once the earth naturally developed an atmosphere and seas all on its own, God then intervened and caused the first life form, the amoeba, to appear in the prebiotic soup. He then allowed for it to evolve on its own. And so from there, you have natural evolution happening with occasional interventions by God to get it to the next level. And then finally, when the time was right, after billions of years, it was time for man to come. And so what God did is he evolved humans from primates by giving them a soul. So you have this monkey-like, man-like thing, and then God gives it a soul, and it becomes humanity and is now separated from all the rest. And so the soul is what sets us above other animals. Now, theistic evolutionists label God's periodic interventions as what they call divinely orchestrated, punctuated equilibrium. And I hope that rings a bell to you, because punctuated equilibrium is an evolutionary theory created by an atheist named Stephen Jay Gould. That was his way to explain, he's like, all right, there's no evidence for evolution. I know evolution happened in such a way that it left no evidence. That's punctuated equilibrium. That did sound as stupid as it did when I said it. His whole thing is evolution. It doesn't happen for a long time, but then it does really fast. But so fast, fossilization can't happen. And so it just looks like new life appeared abruptly. So these guys are taking his word, punctuated equilibrium. They're taking his word and they're just putting a Christian spin on it. Now, a view like this obviously will mesh well with liberal Christianity. It allows it to conform to the views of secular evolutionists. And so what they can do is they could say, listen, we believe most of what you find in a modern typical biology textbook. We believe in evolution. We believe in all these maps and taxonomies and all the stuff that they have. But then they also say, but we also believe in some parts of the Bible, the parts that could pass humanity's judgments. And what I'm telling you is this is not Christian in a meaningful sense. It really isn't. A notable example is the theistic evolutionist organization known as Biologos. I really don't like these people. But anyhow, Biologos is a group of evolutionary scientists that claim to be Christians. And they contend that there's no evidence, meaning there's no contradiction between evolution and Christianity. Now, they are beholden to human authorities over the Bible, and they admit that. They say the Bible's not our final authority. Human interpretations of science is. And so what they say is because we have these two authorities, you have to choose which one is greater should the two disagree, and they will say we explicitly choose evolutionary theory as the greater authority. I'm going to quote Peter Enns. Peter Enns is a theistic evolutionist. He put it like this. He said, quote, "It seems that anyone even minimally interested in having science and Genesis talk to each other need to make some sort of decision, often on the fly, about how Genesis should be read differently. And those decisions at the end of the day move us away from a strictly literal and historical reading of Genesis towards something else, which we may call symbolic or metaphorical." In other words, if you're going to hold to evolution, you have to decide that you can't hold to a straightforward reading of Genesis 1 through 11. So he says it necessarily requires that you can't treat Genesis as history. In fact, theistic evolutionists have no problem insisting that Jesus and the other biblical authors were in error on these topics. They'll say, yeah, Jesus could be wrong. Yeah, we believe he's God, but he could be wrong, as a man. They assume that as a human, he made regular errors, like hitting his thumb with the hammer, and therefore, if he can make a regular human error like that, then he can make mistakes on his views of the earth and the universe and its age and how things happened. In fact, one of the Biologos writers, Kenton Sparkins, he makes this argument. He says, quote, "If Jesus, as a finite human being, erred from time to time, there's no reason at all to suppose that Moses, Paul, and John wrote Scripture without error. Rather, we are wise to assume that the biblical authors expressed themselves as human beings writing from the perspectives of their own finite, broken horizons." End quote. In other words, they're just regular people like us, and they made the errors of their time, and Jesus is included in that group. So, what you take away from that is, if you believe in the general theory of evolution, then you have to believe in an errant Bible. You have to reject the doctrine of inerrancy. You can't hold these two together. Now, of course, I titled this slide that the evolutionists aren't buying it, that they aren't. This doesn't get you any brownie points with them at all. It doesn't make you acceptable to them. Richard Dawkins says this. He says, quote, "I think evangelical Christians have really sort of got it right in a way in seeing evolution as the enemy. Whereas the more, what shall we say, sophisticated theologians who are happy to live with evolution, I think they are deluded. I think the evangelicals have got it right in that there really is a deep incompatibility between evolution and Christianity, and I think I realized that at about the age of 16. End quote. That's what Dawkins said. So he's like, really, these guys are delusional. You're not fooling anybody. We don't respect you as scientists, is what he's saying. And so look, if it was just a matter of believing in evolution, then maybe they would be accepted. But this isn't about just believing in evolution. This is about presuppositions. And secular evolutionists, they don't have room for an evolution that does not operate off naturalism. Okay, and materialistic atomism. It has to be materialism. It has to be naturalism. There can be no foot for God in there. And I quoted quotes in the Arguments for Folly, how some evolutionists openly admitted that, look, we assume naturalism because we refuse to let God have a foot in the door. Even if there's explanations that are better if you assume God, they're like, we rule those out because we will not let him have a foot in the door. I'm thankful that some of them admit that, right? And so, again, it's not about just believing in evolution. It's about the worldview, the isms that undergird it. And so theistic evolutionists, they're invoking a supernatural intervention at key points in their evolution. And to the regular evolutionists, this is heresy. This is anathema. This is excommunicado at this point. And so, look, these guys' quest to be accepted by the secular scientists, they actually, in so doing, they alienate themselves from both the secular scientists and real Bible-believing Christians. They end up being their own little group that think they're smarter than everybody else. And so the question at hand for us is, how does our apologetic deal with theistic evolution? Because it will be a little different. Their view is guarded from our critique of atheism, because, right, their belief in God does remove the problem of the uniformity of nature, the laws of logic, and moral absolutes. They claim to believe in the God of the Bible, so we can't hit them the way we would hit the atheists on the uniformity of nature, laws of logic, and moral absolutes, okay? So where we have to get them is we end up getting them on the arbitrary and groundless punctuated equilibrium of Stephen Jay Gould, right? So the point is we're going to get them on that. When we approach theistic evolution, can our pre-sup arguments work? And yes, because remember, we're not just arguing for any God. We're arguing for the God of the Bible as he reveals himself in the Bible, right? So the fact that it's the God of the Bible, when you have the of the Bible attached to it, that is where we are going to critique them. Because our theology informs our philosophy. It's not supposed to be the other way around. Remember, only the biblical God, this is what we've seen, and this is the 24th lecture, and in all of them, this is what we've seen so far, that only the God of the Bible meets the preconditions of intelligibility. Only the God of the Bible is non-contradictory in his attributes. Okay, that God revealed himself in the scriptures, in the Bible, and those scriptures are beyond contestation. The theistic evolutionist stands against that God's direct statements in those scriptures. And the theistic evolutionist puts himself in judgment over God's revelation. That's where they lose. They're putting themselves in judgment over God's revelation. So what they're doing is they're using man's autonomy to declare what parts of the Bible are true and false. If you could do that, the whole thing's false. It all falls apart. They might as well just be regular evolutionists. But they're not. They claim to believe in the biblical God, but then they reject what the Bible says, and so that makes them inconsistent. And if you have an inconsistent, incoherent worldview, it's not true, right? Now, they justify their inconsistency by privileging finite and non-exhaustive human knowledge. They privilege that above the, the omniscience of God. Okay, above God's infinite knowledge that he gives us truth in his special revelation. So that renders these people as arbitrary. Furthermore, they assume uniformitarian principles, and so then they fall prey to all the arguments I gave in the first 4 lectures against evolution. Their clocks, radiocarbon dating, all the different types of datings. They fall prey to all that, okay? They arbitrarily accept deeply flawed clocks as if they're an infallible fact. And so given that they agree with the faulty uniformitarian assumptions of the atheists, and yet they dismiss the scientific indications of a young earth, it's clear. They just want to be accepted by the world, right? They did not arrive at their conclusions from an unbiased following of the evidence. Instead, they accepted certain naturalistic conclusions a priori because they want the acceptance of the world, and it's those presuppositions that they accept that cause them to dismiss the parts of the Bible that get in the way of evolution. That's how they ended up there. That's the only way they got there. And so the atheists are right about one thing. If evolution could occur by natural processes, then God is not needed. So there is no need for a theistic version of evolution. It's useless. It really is just a waste of space. Now, the greatest problem with theistic evolution is its theological consequences. I'd be remiss if I didn't say this. If all humans did not originate from an originally immortal Adam and Eve, immortal, not immoral, but an originally immortal Adam and Eve, if death did not enter the world through Adam, then the rest of the Bible is untrustworthy. You might as well throw it away in that case. It wouldn't be worth its weight in paper, right? Because it would be untrustworthy. See, Jesus declared that Adam and Eve were literal people in Matthew 19, verses 4 through 6. And so if they weren't, then Jesus is wrong. If Jesus is wrong, he's not the Messiah. He's not the Son of God. It all goes away. And Paul declared that death entered the world through Adam in Romans 5, 12 through 21. In fact, the gospel, in summary, is that Christ as the last Adam fixes what the first Adam broke. Well, without that, the entire theology of redemption crumbles. Our whole meta-narrative disappears if there is no Adam and Eve. And if our narrative of redemption crumbles, then there's no purpose to Christianity. It's like every other religion at that point. Okay? So my point is, if theistic evolution is true, we lose the gospel. Their view actually destroys the gospel. Now, since theistic evolution makes death natural, think about it. Death is natural. That means it's not the curse. Death is not the product of the curse. That means Christ's death would not be substitutionary because Christ's death would have been natural. He would have died anyway. Not as a penalty for us, but it would have been a natural death. And so with no substitution, the doctrine of justification disappears, right? Because justification depends on double alien imputation and vicarious penal substitutionary atonement. And if you don't know what those things are, what is wrong? No, I'm just kidding. So double alien imputation, you do know what these are. You might not have heard these words. Double means what? Two, right? Alien means not you, somebody else. And then imputation means a swapping of accounts, right? So double, you got two parties, you and Christ. You're alien to each other. He has righteousness that is his, but that righteousness is alien to you. You have wickedness that's yours, but it's alien to him. And what happens is you got these two parties double, okay? And what is alien to Christ, your wickedness, gets imputed to him. And what's alien to you, his righteousness, gets imputed to you. That's double alien imputation. That's the doctrine of justification. If death is natural, there is no substitution here, and so we lose that. We lose the gospel. Now, vicarious penal substitutionary atonement is just one little part of that. It means vicarious, means in the place of other, or for the sake of somebody else. Substitution means in their place, and atonement means payment or covering. And so Jesus is our vicarious, meaning for our sake. He is our substitute atonement. He pays the price of our sins for us. And my point is, the gospel depends on those. And if death is natural, we lose the gospel. We really do. You'll find concepts like double alien imputation in 2 Corinthians 5:21. It says, for God made him who knew no sin to be sin, so that in him we would be the righteousness of God. You find that idea right there, okay? And so anyhow, our sins are paid for because Christ paid for them. And it's a gift that is received through faith. So, my point is, if we lose that, if theistic evolution is true, okay, then you end up in a world that's like every other worldview. In theistic evolution, sin is normal, okay? People simply need to try harder, works righteousness. And if they do, then they're divine people meeting good standard. They're good people meeting divine standards. And just read the book of Galatians. That's anathema. Right? So again, theistic evolution brings you there. And, since I've been preaching through Genesis, I know I don't preach that often anymore through Genesis, but I do read a lot of commentaries, and it bothers me that there are evangelical commentaries written by theistic evolutionists, because when you get to the Adam and Eve story, it kind of becomes just symbolic for all of our struggles. Well, then that would mean our sin and our struggles and all that's normal. And that was built into creation. Again, you have no gospel. You just have a works-based system. I'm thankful that the commentators that write that somehow still believe the New Testament. They haven't quite grasped their inconsistency. And that's grace from God. Because if they do, and then they follow it to the conclusion, they would actually deny the gospel. So for that, I am thankful that God sometimes lets us in our stupidity not connect all the dots. Okay, that at times is a means of grace. But anyway, I want you to think about this for a second. What would it mean for death to be natural, right? The Bible describes death as a curse and the last enemy to be destroyed. But if death is natural, then first the Bible's untrue by default because everything I just said would be wrong. But additionally, God becomes a mad scientist and a moral monster if over the course of billions of years he used death to bring us to life as we know it. Imagine billions of years of animals being tortured by other animals and being burned alive in forest fires just because they happen every now and again. Picture babies being ruthlessly eaten by predators. Conceptualize this for billions of years, that creatures contract all kinds of painful diseases and die these torturous deaths. What sadist would call that good? Right? What sadist would call that good? Why would an all-powerful and all-good God who could speak the universe into existence not create a universe that starts out in perfect harmony? Why would he require a 4 billion year-long dystopia where all of creation is stuck in this inescapable Hunger Games where to the victor goes all the spoil? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. Does it make the theistic evolutionists feel good to imagine that our human existence right now is standing on the bones of trillions and trillions of deaths? That's what it took to get here because God couldn't do it in a better way? It's hard to imagine a view that's more reprehensible than that. So, in my opinion, the theistic evolutionist narrative soars at a level of blasphemy that makes other heresies kind of mild in comparison. What their view does to our God is just sickening. So, again, theistic evolution, it is an unacceptable compromise. It's an unnecessary compromise. And so we as Christians need to have a commitment to the truth of the scriptures, and we need to rest on it. Why? Because the Christian worldview, as already described in the Bible, it's the only worldview that meets all these preconditions of intelligibility. If you constantly focus on the scriptures and you apply the transcendental argument for the existence of God, which I've explained in past lessons, if you apply that to all aspects of reality, all it does is demonstrate the biblical worldview to be true beyond any contestation. It shows verisimilitude. Again, I love that word. And it renders all opposing viewpoints as arbitrary and inconsistent nonsense. Furthermore, it assures me as a Christian that any new discovery that supposedly undermines Christianity is nothing more than an anti-Christian interpretation of a discovery that is based on anti-Christian presuppositions. It's nothing more than that. The same fact with Christian presuppositions is going to lead to a different conclusion. It just will. I'm even thinking about all this UFO or UAP stuff, and Congress has been having these hearings because now there's these videos that it's just undeniable. There's stuff up there, right? And so people are like, well, there it is. If there's life on other planets, then that means evolution can happen. But you have some people in the congressional committee, after looking at all the evidence, Congress people saying, and some of the scientists reporting on it saying, this is far more likely interdimensional beings than extraterrestrial life. It's like, that's interesting. The Bible's talked about such beings from the beginning. So, again, two different people, if you're assuming life can and does emerge through spontaneous generation at various parts in the universe, and you see UAPs, you're going to think, aliens. If you don't have that assumption, you look at the same evidence, you're like, no, these are interdimensional beings that are deceiving people. So again, you don't have to be worried about some fact that's going to be discovered. No, that fact is going to be interpreted based on somebody's presuppositions. Ours have verisimilitude and meet the preconditions of intelligibility. Theirs don't. So I'm not like waking up tomorrow afraid that my faith is going to go away. It's not. We hold to the truth, and it's always going to be the truth. Now, last thing I got to talk about is the political controversy. We know that evolution has a big political controversy. Undoubtedly, the general theory of evolution, this has provided the largest cultural opposition to Christianity in the 20th century. It's laid the groundwork for the Marxism and the critical theory and all this oppressor-oppressed stuff. It's laid the groundwork for the LGBT revolution. This was the soil for all of it, right? And so the nature of the battle, it began in the courtrooms with the Scopes trial. Most of you have heard of the Scopes trial in 1925. I used to teach my high school students about it. And the battle continued ever since the Scopes trial with the proponents of general theory of evolution, they have continually, since then, increasingly won the right to teach to teach evolution in nearly every state and all of our public schools and all that. And at the same time, right, the teaching of creationism and even intelligent design has been prohibited. Okay, so that they have won the political battle. Now, it should be noted, though, I do want to say this, that in fact, in the Scopes case, the Christians won. The evolutionist teacher got in trouble. He was found guilty. But the way the media spun it, it ended up being an ideological victory for the evolutionists, even though it was a legal victory for us. And then all the cases after that just kept going in their favor. And so now you have the secular system, or university system, Hollywood, you got the public education system, and many politicians, they all jeer at creationism, and they speak and write pejoratively against it and make you sound like you're a fool if you believe in it. And so we constantly hear the argument that the Bible is untrustworthy because scientists have proven evolution, and that's why we're not allowed to bring our stuff into the schools. The only reason why they've got the monopoly is because it must be established fact. Well, the previous 9 lessons showed it's not established fact. But really, they've just had their success in courts and through propaganda. And they've got a monopoly in the system. And they've been evangelistic about this. This is what I want you to understand. They're evangelistic in their efforts to convince people of their theory. I'm going to read a pretty big block quote from the noteworthy humanist John Dunphy. Here's what John Dunphy says. He says, quote, "I am convinced that the battle for humankind's future must be waged and won in the public school classroom by teachers who correctly perceive their role as proselytizers of a new faith, a religion of humanity that recognizes and respects the spark of what theologians call divinity in every human being. These teachers must embody the same selfless dedication as the most rabid fundamentalist preachers, for they will be ministers of another sort, utilizing a classroom instead of a pulpit to convey humanist values in whatever subject they teach, regardless of the educational level, preschool, daycare, or large-scale university or large state university. The classroom must and will become an arena of conflict between the old and the new, the rotting corpse of Christianity, together with all of its adjacent evils and misery, and the new faith of humanism." End quote. He wrote that, I believe, in 1983. And so from 1983 to now, you do see that our society has taken it's driven off the cliff. They've succeeded at this. They didn't get their utopia with humanism. They've got an unhinged society where boys don't know what a boy is, and girls don't know what a girl is, and mental health seems to just be multiplying, mental health problems, and yet we've got more shrinks than we've ever had, more resources for it, and yet things just keep getting worse, right? It's because these guys are using the school system to evangelize. The teacher unions are just the most evil. Remember, I was a teacher for 15 years, and I remember some of the stuff they would post on the walls in our school were just so incredibly evil. These were not neutral. They're like, we believe in love, no humans illegal, trust science. Like pretty much all these taglines were all things that were like, wait, these are direct lines against certain biblical beliefs, and they're doing this by design. Love is love. Well, of course, what do they mean by that? Anybody should be able to marry whoever they want. It's so catchy, and if you say, I don't believe love is love, then they look at you like you're crazy, like, what kind of evil person are you? But it's like, I know what you mean with that, though. You mean that people who shouldn't be able to love each other should. And then you draw the limits there and you say, well, it won't get any worse than that. And I say, well, no, they're going to be calling for pedophilia soon. No, they won't. That's a slippery slope. 10 years later, the man-boy, what do they call it? The man-boy love association or something like that. They're now gaining traction, and the whole movement is putting their weight behind them. It's crazy. It's just crazy. Now, there's others who make similar claims. Charles Potter, who's one of the signers of the Humanist Manifesto, he wrote this. He wrote, quote, "Education is thus a most powerful ally of humanism, and every public school is a school of humanism," end quote. Philosopher and educator Richard Rorty said his goal at the college level is to, quote, "arrange things so that students who enter as bigoted, homophobic, religious fundamentalists will leave college with views that are more like our own," end quote. And when that happens, occasionally you turn them into snipers, so we have seen. But anyhow, clearly the secularists are using the schools to push their secular religion with evolution as their origin myth. And you have good, godly Christians in the system still, and I'm thankful for them. My fear is at some point the progressive left will be able to push even them out. So it's only a matter of time, unless a turning point is happening, and through our democracy we're able to seize control over all these things. That should be the goal. We'll see what happens, right? Some people are more optimistic than others. Some are more pessimistic. We'll see what happens. But we know that the secularists right now, they are using the schools to push their religion. And it is a religion, okay? And we need to see it as that. With their control of the educational system, they have been able to prevent the introduction of arguments against their viewpoint. That's why a certain person's going onto their campuses, setting up a tent to make these arguments, because it sure as heck isn't going to happen in the classrooms, right? And he did a good job, an amazing job, and that's why they tried to silence him. The funny thing is, these atheists, they call themselves free thinkers, but why do free thinkers then have to silence those who disagree with them? Why do they have to say, we can't even bring this alternative idea into our classroom? That tactic betrays free thinking. Instead, it's reminiscent of the Nazis in the 1930s or the Red Bolsheviks from the USSR. Democracy is built on the open exchanges of ideas and debate. Dictatorship is what is built on using media and education to support only one view while suppressing the rest. And again, one side consistently does that. It's interesting that Christians are often accused of being narrow-minded, like we're narrow-minded, but most Christian schools actually teach both sides of the issue. I don't know if you realize that. They do. And so the question is, do the public schools do that? You might have a rogue teacher that will do both sides. I remember when Rachel was at Oak Hills, her biology teacher, who was an evolutionist, still allowed them to have a debate about it. And I think he even showed the Ken Ham, Bill Nye debate. Although Ken, but anyhow, but he still showed that debate, right? And so that's rare. You almost never hear of that. But in Christian schools, we don't have the fear of alternative viewpoints, because if a view is false, it's false. It doesn't matter how clever the debater is, since the critical mind could detect fallacious arguments, right? I'm not famous, but I watched that debate between Ham and Bill Nye, and Bill Nye thought he was clever, and he did a better job in his presentation. But the next day, I was able to write a blog off the top of my head that disproved every point he said. It doesn't matter that he sounded good up there. The arguments were fallacious. It just was. But anyhow, I think it's ironic that the mentality of the fundamentalist Christians during the Scopes trial is now the mentality of the atheistic evolutionists today. Right? They're the ones who don't want anything coming in. Like in the 1920s, fundamentalists wanted to prevent evolution from ever being mentioned in the schools, probably because they had a misguided fear of it. But today, evolutionists will now fight to the bitter end to try to keep intelligent design out of their institutions. How many people here, it came out maybe like 15 years ago, I think, but have you seen Ben Stein's documentary, Expelled? I remember when I just saw that, I'm like, wow. But yeah, he went to university to university, said, look, here's all these PhD scientists with accredited, doctorates, and they've written amazing stuff in peer-reviewed journals, and they hold to intelligent design, and they're willing to argue this and teach it. No, we won't even hire them. That's just crazy. Crazy. I watched that. I'm like, man, we definitely lost the secular universities. But anyhow, in their tenacious attempts to silence advocates of intelligent design, as they've done this in the courts, you got the ACLU and all these universities, what they're doing is they're demonstrating that the controversy is more than just a difference of opinion. People don't go that crazy over a difference of opinion, right? People aren't going to soak millions of dollars to just prevent another opinion, right? There's something spiritual at work here. These universities, just to kind of prove that, they tolerate religions like Islam. And they have students read these pieces of Islamic literature, Arabian Nights and all that. But when it comes to Christianity, they mock it. Rarely is stuff read, and if it is, it's read in order so they could knock it. And universities, they typically support the feminist movement and gay rights, yet Islamic countries execute women for feminism. They throw homosexuals off the top of the buildings, and yet in the university, they're going to push feminism and still celebrate Islamicism and let them take over their whole campuses and protest. It's very interesting. Where is their outcry against Islam? Where are the liberal giants on the issues like this? What's his name? Doug Wilson says that, he thinks women are designed for the home, and how dare he? Come on. Muslims are saying they're designed for a head covering, and to just be a sexual object. Well, that's different, you white imperialist. And so it's like, come on. You guys can't even be consistent, right? And so all we see now is moral anarchy. I mean, think about it. Right after Hamas massacred a bunch of innocent Jews on October 7th, 2023, liberals protested in favor of the terrorists. This whole idea that women need to be protected. Rape is always wrong. Well, what about all these women that were sexually assaulted? In this case, rape is resistance. It's crazy. And the UN didn't say a thing. Didn't say a thing. It's just twisted. Twisted. And so again, why is it this way? We all know. Wide is the path that leads to destruction, but the path that leads to salvation is only as wide as the Savior's arms stretched on that cross. That's it. That's the narrow path. The feminists might have an opposite view from the Muslim, but they both work together to undermine Christianity because they're on the same side. They're on the same road, and they don't see their inherent disagreement with each other because they're too busy hating us. That's really what it comes down to. The political controversy over evolution is just another example of this dichotomy of truth and error. All types of error are permitted in a society like ours and even promoted, but the only view that is absolutely forbidden is the Christian one, and that should make people wonder. It really should. People should start to think like, why only us? It's because we got the truth. Now, some final thoughts, and then we'll be done. Okay, the last 9 lectures offered a big refutation of the general theory of evolution, but what I want to recommend you guys do is dig deeper. Okay, yes, I gave you a lot. If you take this and you memorize everything I said, you're going to be able to handle just about any evolutionist you're going to run into on the street. But what I'm telling you is there's a lot more material than what I was able to present here. And I'm thankful that the Christian today has exponentially more stuff we could pull from than Christians did a couple decades ago. So what I recommend is that you read books and articles from Creation Ministry International. We're actually going to have them come and speak here again in January. It's not going to be Dr. Sarfati. I wanted it to be him, but they're not going to fly him here. They got a guy in California. I'm like, that's not the same. But anyhow, we're going to have a Creation Ministry, a CMI guy out here in January on a Sunday morning, and he's going to give us a lot of cool stuff, right? You also got what do you call it? You have Answers in Genesis, Ken Ham's group. They're really good. I can't wait to go to that Creation Museum. I've been wanting to go for a while, and I'm planning on it. And then you also have Creation Research Institute, CRI, and there's other organizations as well. But even just with those 3, if you subscribe on their website for free and you get the weekly emails, you got plenty of stuff to read, and it's all solid. It really is. It'll fill your arsenal against the GTE. And when this guy comes in January, he's going to bring their bookstore, and we're going to have to set up the tables and sell the stuff at a discount anyway. So you'll be able to buy a lot of stuff then. So if you go on their websites and you're like, oh, I want that, I would wait until January. You'll get it cheaper if you buy it here. At least that's what happened last time they were here. So anyhow, you'll find a lot of good stuff from those organizations. Now, in terms of dialoguing or debating with these people, you might be wondering, okay, apart from a biology classroom, what kind of scenario will there be where this subject is going to come up and I'll be able to use this kind of stuff? Well, and by the way, when it happens, my suggestion is start from the argument from folly, like I did. That's why the first 4 lessons, the argument from folly, and then after you destroy their worldview, go to the argument from truth, right, which is what we finished today. But I'll tell you an example in which this occurred in my life, and you would think like, wow, you got into an argument about evolution through a taught a conversation about diet? Sure did, right? So, one of my relatives, this is probably like 10 years ago or so, maybe more than that, he informed me that he subscribed to a diet called the Paleolithic diet, or nicknamed the Paleo diet. And supposedly, he's telling me, look, this is the diet that hominids from 3 million years ago until about 10,000 years ago were eating. It's the caveman's diet, and it assumes that from that period, 3 million years ago to 100,000 years ago, that man mainly ate fish, grass-fed meats, certain vegetables, fruits, nuts, and roots, but they did not have dairy, grains, salt, or anything processed. And so what they say is that since this allegedly occurred prior to us inventing agriculture, meaning farming, that humans were limited for millions of years to what was available to them, and so we adapted to those kind of foods, right? That we inherited our genetic adaptation to food from these cavemen, right? And they adapted it from the earlier ape-like ancestors. And as a result, what they'll say is the foods we introduced after agriculture that are common to us, they harm us because we're not genetically adapted to them, right? Now, of course, we just know that's a fad diet, and they just gave a really interesting sounding explanation. And listen, the diet works at least one time. It worked for me once. And then the second time, my body's like, I know this cheat code, and it didn't work after that. So now the only thing that works for me is calorie counting. But the reason why this diet endured for a while is pragmatism. Listen, we're a sedentary people that sit behind desks. Of course we're going to lose weight and feel healthier if we eat lean meats and stay away from simple carbohydrates. Atkins could tell you to do the same thing without the baloney theory, right, of what cavemen ate. So again, it's just a scientific ad hoc story that they added to their diet, and then because they gave this scientific explanation, it sells like oil. But my point that I made to my relative who said this is no one knows what cavemen ate. How can you know what cavemen ate? They didn't leave written records. Okay, you could analyze hearth sites and fossilized dookies or fecal matter, which they have, and even teeth plaque from skeletons, and that could give you a glimpse of what those particular skeletons ate when they were alive. Okay, what certain nomads ate, but you cannot extrapolate that into a 3 million year long narrative of what all humans everywhere ate using uniformitarian assumptions. You just can't. Okay, the data might be real, like stone tools and bones and cave art, but the story that you tell about that data fully depends on the presuppositions and lens that you use. If a person instead assumes that this is, if a person assumes this is the way it was and they believe the evolutionary narrative, then yeah, masses will accept it. So when my relative brought this up, I objected to its name. I said, how could you know whether or not this Paleolithic era even happened the way they say it did, when it did, and how could you know what they ate? And he looked at me with a puzzled look, like, oh, here's my religiously fanatical, fundamentalist younger relative. And but then I continued asking. I said, well, hold on. What kind of evidence is necessary to prove that a Paleolithic group of humans moved from place to place eating these foods? They didn't build cities, and so the evidence they left would have been minimal. They didn't plant fields. They didn't stay in one place. They had no written language, according to your theory, to leave any concrete records for us. And since they were constantly on the move and didn't settle anywhere, storms and rain would erode the 99.9999% of any evidence that these guys even existed. So you're in a position like Stephen Jay Gould where you're saying, well, Paleolithic man lived in a way that left no evidence for Paleolithic man. Gotcha. And you're going to base a whole diet off of that. So again, he conceded after I said all that. He's like, yeah, you're right. I can't prove any of that. I'm like, yes. So anyhow, that example is just one more illustration of how evolutionary thought permeates everything. It's not built upon arguments with lines of true evidence. Instead, it's just a technical explanation that's riddled with all sorts of assumptions that have not been proven and can be proven to be wrong, right? But again, it's because of the vocabulary and how impressive it sounds. People think it's solid evidence, but it's not. So again, had my relative, I was hoping he would have taken the bait and fought me harder, because then I was ready to go into all this other stuff, but he didn't. He gave up. I'm like, man, that was too easy. But should they want to push back and say, oh yeah, well, the feather-birded dinosaurs, what about that? We've got the fossils. It's like, yes, game on, right? And then you go into that other stuff we talked about, but he didn't do that. So anyhow, there's a lot of scenarios in which you could have this argument over evolution. I knew a woman, Brian. He did, mainly because he did get me to do the diet, but only because he admitted that all that other stuff was baloney, And then he gave, because he's a doctor, and he gave that made much more sense after our argument. He's like, to be real, your body digests lean protein slower, so you feel full longer, and you overall by the end of the day you'll eat less calories. I'm like, so it's calorie count? And he's like, yes, but you don't feel hungry. I'm like, okay, that's how he convinced me. But the paleo stuff, I would have never tried it if he didn't change his sales pitch. But, I knew this woman who took a biology class at the local junior college, and when the instructor in her biology class started giving the pawns to people speech, she kept asking him how he knew this. Like, how? And finally he just said, listen, I have a master's degree, you're just a freshman, be quiet. Like, okay, if that's your argument, you've already lost. You've already lost. And so the Christian needs to always be ready to demonstrate the folly of the general theory of evolution, and we need to advance the Christian worldview. So let me conclude, and then I'll kill the stream, and then I'll take a few questions. So, in summation, the general theory of evolution, it is a failed worldview. It's arbitrary, it's inconsistent, whereas ours is the opposite. We have a coherent worldview that accounts for everything we experience. The creation narrative in Genesis provides details that wonderfully match the data of the real world. Likewise, the flood provides a coherent explanation for the geological and fossil records. The biblical account also proposed two bottlenecks long before modern genetic data compelled our secular opponents to do the same. And so the parts of the narrative that secularists tend to find fantastical, like, well, you believe in this and that, you know what? They all have reasonable scientific explanations that correspond with the details of the text. So we don't have ad hoc stories or just so stories to explain what we believe. We are making reasonable inferences based on the details of what the text provides, like I did with the languages earlier. Okay, Genesis doesn't say everything I said, but based on what it does say, you have to make inferences, and those inferences match what we see in the real world. That's justified. That's not ad hoc. It's not just so, right? And in addition to that, the biblical worldview accounts for the transcendental preconditions of intelligibility, and it provides the only narrative that'll make sense out of the physical evidence that does exist in the world. So I'm hoping by using evolution to give an extended argument from folly and an extended argument from truth, that you could see how presuppositionalism could even be expanded into a big macro and micro level. And what I mean is my other topics, I tend to, what I've done with it is I'm giving you the introduction, right? And this will work against the average person, but against an expert, I've given you where to start. With evolution, I said, let's see what it looks like if you've had to go deeper. That's why I took 9 lessons instead of 2 or 3. But anyhow, that's all I got. So, any questions?